Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Carlos Series, and this is my YouTube channel, grecochess. We're continuing with the online tournament grecochess that is taking place at the platform of chess.com, and there is one more game that has been completed, and we're going to present it to you now in this video. But let me first share the screen with you. And here we are. With the white pieces is Boris Alexandrovich Peasants with a rating of 891, and with the black pieces is Barracks 7 with a rating of 1669. You see there is an enormous difference of the ratings. Barracks 7 has almost twice the rating of Boris, which means that he's a favorite to win, but let's see what actually happened in the game. Boris with the white pieces, he starts with the book move, the pawn goes to e4, and Barak 7 replies with the pawn to e6, the French defense. Pawn goes to d4 for white, the two pawns occupy the center, and pawn goes to d5 for black. That's typical response for the French defense. Third move, the advanced variation, pawn goes to e5 for white, occupies much more space than black, and black has only one way to respond, exactly. Pawn goes to c5. Next move, pawn goes to c3 for white to protect the pawn at d4, to protect the d4 square, and black replies by sending the queen to b6. Myself, I played these same four moves many times. It's a nice solid way, both for white and for black. And let's not jump. Knight to f3 for white exactly to support the d4 pawn. And black will send the knight to c6 exactly to attack it. It's a battle around the d4 pawn. If two sides, of course, play perfectly, no side can get an advantage, but it's very easy for either side to make a mistake. Pawn to e2 for white to develop the bishop, not pawn, bishop to e2 to develop the bishop and be ready for castling. Black will send the knight to h6. Now here there is a catch. If white decides to take the knight at h6 and double the pawns on the H file, then black will not, that's what they are hoping, will not immediately take back the bishop, but first the queen will take the pawn on b2, threaten the rook on a1, and if white can find a way to save the rook, then black can take back the bishop and have an extra pawn. But let's see what will actually happen. White does not fall for that. Oh, the computer would like, believe it or not, the computer would like the bishop to take on h6. Until now, the first uh, 6 moves are book moves, as you see. You see the book sign here. White has a small advantage of 0.5 just because he started first, but White decides not to take the chance. They don't want to risk their pawn to, in fact, to lose their pawn on b2 and start a series that who knows where it would lead. But they decide to castle, which the computer thinks it is a good move. You see the check mark, but not ideal. Ideally, the computer would rather have white go for the knight at h6. Take it. You see the green arrow. But it's not easy for a human to play. Even me, that I'm looking at it, I'm not sure how White would get advantage of that. But their advantage from 0.5 goes down to 0.2. You see here. And even me, when I've played with Black, I was hoping that Black would take the knight, and if they did so, would take the pawn at b2. Now we are out of book. How will Black play? Take the pawn on d4, the best move. You see the star here. White will take back with the pawn. The computer doesn't like it. The computer would rather have the pawn go to b4. But this creates holes on white's position. That's why white would not like it. There are many times when General principle of theory suggests one move, the computer would like another move. And sometimes, if it is not obvious, sometimes it can be obvious why you would rather break the principles. But if it's not obvious, this means that even if the computer move is the best, it's very difficult later on to find the correct follow-up. And if you don't, you may be left behind. That's why I cannot criticize the pawn taking to d4, even though the computer puts a question mark, meaning a mistake. Let's see what the comments on the computer. This misses an opportunity to eventually win a pawn. And now black is ahead by 0.7, you see. Black is going to use the knight to send it to f5. Of course, now black has no reason to risk having the double pawns on the h file. If the white bishop would take the knight, knight goes from h6 to f5, and of course the knight is attacking the pawn on d4, is much near the center, and you see the exclamation mark, which means a great move, not just the best move, but a great move. Bishop to e3 for white to protect the pawn at d4. Computer would rather have castling, but now it's a little bit obvious why this may not be a good move. It's a mistake because the b2 pawn is lost, and then white will have to fight to not to lose the rook. Of course, they can. They're not going to lose it. There are many ways to protect it, but they will waste a move instead of doing something better to just save the rook. Let's see how black will play. Oh, they miss a chance. The computer would rather have the queen take the pawn, as I mentioned. Instead, the knight from f5 takes the bishop on e3, but they might have a second chance because white will need to recapture the knight, and then perhaps he'll take the pawn. Let's see if this is going to happen. They take it back, yes, exclamation mark, not exclamation mark, it's a star, the best move, of course. What else can white do? They must take back the material. White has two double pawns on the e file, but the rook on f1 has a great potential, you see. No white pawns in front of it, and if they move the knight, for example, to f3, they attack the f7 pawn twice. Let's see how will black react. They took the pawn, star, the best move, and now black is ahead by 1.1. So you see Barack 7 is ahead by 1.1, but that's not yet enough to win the game. They need to continue correctly. Let's see how will they continue. Knight to d2, of course, white saves the rook, and white is not going to win any further material at this point. Queen to c3, the best move according to the computer. And white sends the rook to c1 to threaten the black queen. Computer thinks a mistake, and it says loses a pawn. Yes, the pawn on e3 will be lost. Let's see if black will, not only lost, but with a check. See if black will find it. Yes, Barak 7 wins a pawn, and now they're ahead by 2 pawns. Check, and white sends the king to h1, yes. Star the best, I think it's almost the only one. What else can they do? Put the rook on f2, perhaps. And pin the rook, well, that would not be good. And black now is going to grab a pawn on d4. But the computer would rather have the bishop develop to e7 instead of pawn grabbing. White knight takes on d4, and the queen takes on d4. At this point, black is ahead by 3 pawns. You see the +3 here, that's what it means. Black is ahead by 3. Material-wise, white is ahead by 1.5. So why is this the reason, you may wonder, why black with 3 extra pawns is behind overall? Because white has developed almost all of their pieces. In fact, all of their pieces, they have castles. The rooks are on c1, f1, the queen on d1. Only the queen has not been developed for white. The knight on d2, bishop on e2. Compared with black, only the queen is out of its starting position and a couple of pawns. The two rooks, the two bishops, and the king at their original squares, and black has not castled. For white, if they can only move the queen on d1, they finish the development. Of course, it's not safe to do it. They have to worry about the knight at d2 at this point. But let's see how the game is going to continue. White sends the knight to f3 because they want the queen to be free to go without having to worry about protecting the knight. According to the computer, There was only one good move there, the one you see with the arrow. Bishop goes to b5 and check. And the computer says this permits the opponent to trade down material. Why? As I mentioned before, the advantage of white was that they had developed all of their pieces, but they were down by 3 pawns. But now black can start exchanging queens, and with fewer pieces remaining, the early development is not so important. But the 3 extra pawns will be crucial. And one of them, by the way, the pawn of d5, you see it here, is a passed pawn. There are no pawns on the C and E files that can stop it. Not only that, it's what's called a protected pass pawns. The pawn on E6 protects the one at D5. Let's see how game will continue. Suddenly, from white being up by 1.5, black is up by 3.3, even though there was no material exchange, just from the fact that white loses the long-term advantage ahead. Let's see how will the game continue. Black, yes, exchange queens. Not a good way to take it back. Look at it. White had 3 ways to take it back with the bishop or with the rooks. They took it to the bishop, and now what it means is that the 2 rooks have less of a scope. They don't connect with each other, and they have fewer squares where they can go, while the bishop goes back to the first rank. Not a good decision for white, and so black's advantage increases even more to 3.8. Black has 3 extra pawns. They developed their light colored square to D7 instead of the dark color. Computer would prefer the dark color so black can castle a king size. Now they cannot castle at all for the time being. Even queen size, the rook on C1 does not allow them to castle. White sends the rook to C7. Great. The rooks on the 7th rank, the white rooks on the 7th, or black on the 2nd rank are very strong. Of course, they attack the pawn on b7. They don't attack the bishop protected by the king, but if black was to move the bishop and castle, they would lose their bishop on d7. Black sends the bishop to c6. It's very tempting because now you constrain the rook on c6. So the bishop on c6 constrains the rook on c7. And if the king would go, for example, from e8 to d8, the white rook has nowhere to go. They might take a bishop, but they would lose an exchange like that. But the computer doesn't like it. It would rather have the bishop go from f8 to e7. In fact, this is not just inaccuracy, it's a mistake for black. And black advantage becomes minimal, just 0.5. Let's see how the game continues. Knight goes to d4, great move. Why great? Because they can take the bishop, and if they take the bishop, then pawn takes back and the rook wins the pawn. So the rook on c7, instead of being isolated and in danger, will become very much more powerful now. Bishop to e7 for black, who is ready to castle, or is not. Legally, they can castle next move, but if they do so, they lose their bishop on e7. So they'll need one more move to send the bishop somewhere else. White, knight takes the bishop, and after this exchange, they'll win the pawn. And not only that, the rook on c7 has much more freedom. Computer doesn't like it. That's what I would play. Computer wants the bishop to go to a4 and threaten the pawn on c6 with a check and threaten the rook on a8. As I say, delayed gratification. White went for the immediate gratification, grabbed the pawn, and just when they were down only 0.4, now they're down by 3.6. Mistake. Only one move worked there, and this wasn't. The move that would work was the bishop to a4. And black castles. Yes, white won the pawn, but look at that. Before, black could not castle because he would lose the bishop on e7. But with the white rook moving to c6, black was free to castle. Black is up by 2 pawns instead of 3, but they have a much better position, 3.6 advantage. White sends the bishop to f3. Good is a computer, that's fine, but not the best. The best would be rook to c7, to rook on the 7th rank, attacks the bishop. Black will have to spend a move to defend the bishop, and then white could bring the other rook on b1 and b7. Rook to c8 for black. Computer likes rook to c8, but they believe the other rook should go there so that the pawn on a7 would be defended. Of course, black is ahead by 2 pawns. They want exchanges. And that's what happens. They got their exchanges and their advantage is up by 4.4. Look at that. Both sides have king, rook, and bishop. In fact, opposite color bishops. But look at their pawns. White has 4, black has 6, and even worse for white, the d5 pawn is a connected pass pawn. Now, if the a pawns are very crucial because if any side can take the e pawn of, excuse me, the a pawn of the other side, their own a pawn becomes a pass pawn. Rook goes to a1 to protect the pawn. Excellent is a computer, but they would prefer the pawn go to g3 to give what's called luft to the king, meaning if black checks with the rook from c8, there's a rook on a1 to stop it. But if the rook from a1 went anywhere outside the first rank, then that could be a mate. That's why the computer thinks better give now the air that the king needs, the luft, while they are not in a hurry, and then do anything else. Bishop to a3 for black, and it stops the a pawn from advancing. Computer would rather have the bishop go to g5 because perhaps then rooks could easily be exchanged. King goes to g1 for whites to really start giving this luft. So the king can go to f2 if necessary from a check. The computer would rather have the h pawn start moving. You want your pawn to move, and also it's much safer for luft because if the f2 is controlled by the black bishop, then even this luft will not work for white. And black exchanges, of course, rooks, and the advantage is more significant. But there is one detail, the opposite colored bishops. If in the ending each side has king, bishops, and pawns, and if these bishops are opposite colors, like here, the white is light colored and the black is dark colored, then it's I wouldn't say very easy, but it is possible for the side to reach a draw, even for the side that may be down by 1 or 2 pawns, because the pawns cannot be pushed too much. They may end up in a square that's controlled by the other side bishop, but their own side bishop cannot support it if they are opposite color. Of course, you may be able to bring the king nearby, but it's not so easy. So if you're down by 1 or 2 pawns, try to go to an opposite color bishop to hope for a draw. And if you're up, make sure you don't end up in an opposite color bishop. Bishop goes to d1 for white, to b2 for black, and now there's two. They are attacking the pawn on e5. And the computer would rather have it from f4, but I don't think there's much of a difference. The e5 pawn is going to be lost, it seems. Let's see if so, but that's what black's aim. And then you have connected pass pawns e6 and d5. Bishop to b3 for white, and yes, they lost. Black is up ahead by 3 pawns, and d5 and e6 are connected pass pawns. Yes, they are attacked by the white bishop, but if black is careful, and especially if they activate their king, then the king can support this pawn, so they can be pushed much easier. White sends the king to f2. Yes, activate your king. And black will take a pawn on h2. They are up by 4 pawns. Excellent move. But can the black bishop survive and escape? You may remember in a previous game I had myself in a tournament. Because I grabbed the pawn a little bit too early, my bishop ended up being lost. Here, white can play the pawn to g3, and then the black bishop has nowhere to go. Of course, they would be able to grab it, be ahead by 5 pawns and lose the bishop and have a good chance to win, but why lose the bishop? But will white fight for the bishop? How? Yes, pawn to g3, right on target is the computer, so black has to worry about their bishop because now it cannot be taken, but if the king goes to g2, then where can the bishop go? And black without the bishop, in spite of their extra pawns, it's not going to be easy to win. Black decides not to save the bishop, but push the pawn to d4. The white king goes to g2 to threaten the bishop. The bishop will take the pawn. Desperado, as they call it. The bishop is going to get lost, so at least let's win the pawn. And black will send the other pawn to e5. So black has 6 pawns, white has a bishop and 1 pawn. And out of the 6 pawns, you see the 5 of them are passed pawns. D, E, F, G, H are passed pawns, all of them. But white, it seems, in spite of the extra bishop, it's almost impossible to win, but at least can they get a draw? Let's see. King goes to f3 for white. King to f8 for black. Great move. It does nothing now, but it brings the king nearer to the center of action. King goes to e4. Pawn to f6. And black has a wonderful pawn chain. g7, f6, e5, d4. None of these pawns can be taken. If you have a pawn chain, you attack at the basis. The basis is g7 with the king next to that, so white cannot easily win any of the pawns. Perhaps the h7, if they can bring the bishop to h2 and remove the king, this will take 3 moves. Yes, black sends a bishop to c2 to start attacking, but it's enough time for black to start pushing the h-pawn. Instead, they push the g-pawn to g5. Not the best. Computer would rather have the king go to f7, even if it meant lost the h7 pawn. Not now, the king is in the middle, but still black has an advantage, 2.7. King goes to f5 for white, near the basis, but the black king goes to e7 to protect f6, now the basis of the chain. King to e4 goes back, pawn to h5 for black. Black wants to have a second front. The D and the H pawns are the most advanced. So the idea is that if white can focus on one side and stop it, the other pawn will promote. King to f5 and pawn to h4 for black. D4, h4, the most advanced black pawns far from each other. So it's the white king cannot stop both of them. The bishop perhaps might be able to stop them. Let's see. King to g4, not allowing the h4 pawn to continue, but black will start now pushing on the other side, the a pawn. That is not a passed pawn because of the a2 pawn in front of it, but they strengthen their position. 4.3 ahead for black. White sends the king to f5, which allows the pawn to go to h3, and it's not easy to get stopped. The white bishop does not attack. h2 is a dark colored square, it cannot be stopped there. Maybe if the bishop goes to e4, it may stop the control of the h1 square. And that's what white does. Bishop goes to e4, but that means that can only stop one pawn, the h pawn. You see, black has an enormous advantage of 6.8. Black pawn goes to h2, so the white bishop must stay on the long diagonal from h1 to a8 to stop the pawn from promoting, or if it promotes, to take the new queen that will emerge. King goes to g3 to be near, and the king has a chance in 2-3 moves to grab the pawn. But black is going to push the d pawn, goes to d3. The white bishop cannot take it because then the h pawn promotes. King goes to g3, ready to grab the pawn on h2, and black sends a pawn on d2. Look at that. It seems that white is one move too late. If the king takes the pawn, the h2 pawn, the d2 pawn goes to d1 and promotes. If the bishop goes to f3, it controls both promotion squares, d1 and h1, but one pawn promotes, bishop grabs it, the other pawn promotes, and it's a queen that will decide the game. Let's see what will happen. The king got the h2 pawn, and the d pawn became a queen. With an extra queen, black has an advantage of 7.1. And at this point, it seems that white's hopes are very, very limited, unless black blunders the queen. White sends the king to g3, and black wins the pawn on a, One doesn't win nothing. One black sends the queen on a1, threatens the pawn on a2. Yes, can be saved, but black is going to win. At this point, you see white resigned. And by resigning, Barak 7 got a second queen. And let's see, before we go to the review, we'll do the review later, how are things going in the four groups of Greco chess. Let's share once again. Now I want to share the entire screen. And here we are. You can see how is the situation in all the four groups. Group 1, nothing is changing. Maxim Govorukha is still ahead with 2 wins in 2 games. But Butterfly with 1 win, 1 loss, and has some chances. U86 3032 has 1 win, 3 losses, limited chances, but still theoretically might advance. And Hunting Achievements have not even started playing. Group number 2, the one that we just ended now, Barak 7 and MGC 89 have 4 wins in 4 games, so everything will be decided in the games between the two of them. Whoever gets more points than the other advances. If they end up with 1 point each, both of them advance. While Andrea Mart and Boris Alexandrovich Pesens are eliminated. They have completed all of their games, and they don't have enough points to have any chance, no matter what happens between Barak 7 and GC 89. Group number 3, where I belong, UV 1415 has lost all 6 games with timeout. This is what the red 0 means. It means that you lost from timeout, while the blue 0 means that you just played and lost. And the other 3 players, Abu Taleb from Iran, myself from Greece, and the line from Hungary, have 2 points from the times out of UV 1415, and the games are still in progress. And in Group 4, my skin from Italy, with 6 wins in 6 games, has advanced to the final round. And let's see what happened in the game review. What does it say? 79.3 accuracy for Boris Alexandrovich Pesens and 84.3 for Barak 7, and they played as if their rating was for 1450 for Boris Alexandrovich Pesens, much higher than their 891. And Barak 7 played a little bit better with a rating of 1669. Barak 7 played for a rating of 1700. And let's see the various categories. How are we doing? No brilliant moves, great moves. 3 for black, 1 for white. Best 17 for white, 14 for 14, best 17 for black, 14 for white. Excellent, 11 for white, 10 for black. Good moves, 5 for white, 4 for black. Book moves, each of them. And in the negative category, 2 inaccuracies from each side. Mistakes, 5 for white, 2 for black. And neither side had a miss or a blunder. This concludes the coverage of the latest game that has just been concluded. Before we continue, once again, the announcement. The tournament that I'm suggesting people join, and here we are. Underwater Moonlight, the Nine Moons tournament. My subscriber Zanilo from Italy is organizing it. Until now, we have 7 out of the 243 people registered. Once we have 243 registered, it starts. I have registered myself. I would suggest to the viewers, if you'd like to participate in the tournament, especially if you have a chess.com account, please join. And thanks for watching. Thanks to all the viewers, to the subscribers. Of course, if you have not subscribed, just click the subscribe button. That's all it takes. And thanks to the likes, we have had some likes from time to time and some nice encouraging comments. Thanks to all of you. I'm Harry Lasanesiris. This is my Greco Chess channel. Ladies and gentlemen, for now, goodbye.